In Jerusalem's Lot, the first story in the collection, the primal fateful forces of a century-old curse draws Charles Boone to a rather unusual family estate, to a deserted town with a satanic history, and to discover the gruesome...
Into the cold, draughty hall here at Chapelwaite, every bone in an ache from that abominable coach, in need of instant relief from my distended bladder, and to see a letter addressed in your own inimitable scrawl, propped on the obscene little cherrywood table beside the door. Be assured that I set to deciphering it as soon as the needs of the body were attended to, in a coldly ornate downstairs bathroom where I could see my breath rising before my eyes. I am glad to hear that you are recovered from the miasma that has so long set in your lungs, although I assure you that I do sympathize with the moral dilemma the cure has affected you with. An ailing abolitionist healed by the sunny climes of slave-struck Florida. Still in all, Bones, I ask you as a friend who has also walked in the valley of the shadow to take care of yourself, and venture not back to Massachusetts until your body gives you leave. Your fine mind and incisive pen cannot serve us if you are clay, and if the southern zone is a healing one, is there not poetic justice in that? Yes, the house is quite as fine as I had been led to believe by my cousin's executors, but rather more sinister. It sits atop a huge and jutting point of land, perhaps 3 miles north of Falmouth and 9 miles north of Portland. Behind it are some 4 acres of grounds, gone back to the wild in the most formidable manner imaginable. Junipers, scrub vines, bushes, and various forms of creeper climb wildly over the picturesque stone walls that separate the estate from the town domain. Awful imitations of Greek statuary peer blindly through the rack from atop various hillocks. They seem, in most cases, about to lunge at the passer-by. My cousin Stephen's taste seemed to have run the gamut from the unacceptable to the downright horrific. There is an odd little summer house which has been nearly buried in scarlet sumac, and a grotesque sundial in the midst of what must once have been a garden. It adds a final lunatic touch. But the view from the parlor more than excuses this. I command a dizzying view of the rocks at the foot of Chapelwaite Head and the Atlantic itself. A huge, bellied bay window looks out on this, and a huge, toad-like secretary stands beside it. It will do nicely for the start of that novel which I have talked of so long, and no doubt tiresomely. Today has been gray, with occasional splatters of rain. As I look out, all seems to be a study in slate. The rocks, old and worn as time itself, the sky, and of course the sea, which crashes against the granite fangs below with a sound which is not precisely sound, but vibration. I can feel the waves with my feet, even as I write. The sensation is not a wholly unpleasant one. I know you disapprove of my solitary habits, dear Bones, but I assure you that I am fine and happy. Calvin is with me, as practical, silent, and as dependable as ever. And by midweek I am sure that between the two of us we shall have straightened our affairs and made arrangement for necessary deliveries from town, and a company of cleaning women to begin blowing the dust from this place. I will close. There are so many things as yet to be seen, rooms to explore, and doubtless 1,000 pieces of execrable furniture to be viewed by these tender eyes. Once again, my thanks for the touch of familiar brought by your letter, and for your continuing regard. Give my love to your wife, as you both have mine. Charles. October 6th, 1850. Dear Bones, such a place this is! It continues to amaze me, as do the reactions of the townfolk in the closest village to my occupancy. That is a queer little place, with the picturesque name of Preacher's Corners. It was there that Calvin contracted for the weekly provisions. The other errand, that of securing a sufficient supply of cordwood for the winter, was likewise taken care of. But Cal returned with gloomy countenance, and when I asked him what the trouble was, he replied grimly enough, "They think you mad, Mr. Boone." I laughed and said that perhaps they had heard of the brain fever I suffered after my Sarah died. Certainly I spoke madly enough at that time, as you could attest. But Cal protested that no one knew anything of me except through my cousin, Stephen, who contracted for the same services as I have now made provision for. What was said, sir, was that anyone who would live in Chapelwaite must be either a lunatic or run the risk of becoming one. This left me utterly perplexed, as you may imagine, and I asked who had given him this amazing communication. He told me that he had been referred to a sullen and rather besotted pulp logger named Thompson, who owned 400 acres of pine, birch, and spruce, and who logs it, with the help of his 5 sons, for sale to the mills in Portland and to householders in the immediate area. When Cal, all unknowing in his queer prejudice, gave him the location to which the wood was to be brought, this Thompson stared at him with his mouth ajaw and said that he would send his sons with the wood in the good light of the day and by the sea road. Calvin, apparently misreading my bemusement for distress, hastened to say that the man reeked of cheap whiskey, and that he had then lapsed into some kind of nonsense about a deserted village and Cousin Stephen's relations and worms. Calvin finished his business with one of the Thompson boys, who I take it was rather surly and none too sober or freshly scented himself. None of this has bothered me much. We know how rustics dearly love to enrich their lives with the smell of scandal and myth, and I suppose poor Stephen and his side of the family are fair game. As I told Cal, a man who has fallen to his death almost from his own front porch is more than likely to stir talk. The house itself is a constant amazement. 23 rooms, Bones. The wainscoting which panels the upper floors and the portrait gallery is mildewed but still stout. While I stood in my late cousin's upstairs bedroom, I could hear the rats scuttering behind it. And big ones they must be, for the sound they make, almost like people walking there. I should hate to encounter one in the dark, or even in the light, for that matter. Still, I have noted neither holes nor droppings. Odd. The upper gallery is lined with bad portraits in frames which must be worth a fortune. Some bear a resemblance to Stephen, as I remember him. I believe I have correctly identified my Uncle Henry Boone and his wife Judith. The others are unfamiliar. I suppose one of them may be my own notorious grandfather, Robert. But Stephen's side of the family is all but unknown to me, for which I am heartily sorry. The same good humor that shone in Stephen's letters to Sarah and me, the same light of high intellect, shines in these portraits, bad as they are. For what foolish reasons families fall out. A rifled escritoire, hard words between brothers now dead 3 generations, and blameless descendants are needlessly estranged. I cannot help reflecting how fortunate it was that you and John Petty succeeded in contacting Stephen when it seemed I might follow my Sarah through the gates, and upon how unfortunate it was that chance that should have robbed us of a face-to-face meeting. How I would have loved to hear him defend the ancestral statuary and furnishings. But do not let me denigrate the place to an extreme. Stephen's taste was not my own, true. But beneath the veneer of his additions there are pieces, a number of them shrouded by dust covers in the upper chambers, which are true masterworks. There are beds, tables, and heavy dark scrollings done in teak and mahogany, and many of the bedrooms and receiving chambers, the upper study and small parlor, hold a somber charm. The floors are rich pine that glow with an inner and secret light. There is dignity here, dignity and the weight of years. I cannot say I like it, but I do respect it. I am eager to watch it change as we revolve through the changes of this northern clime. Lord, I run on. Write soon, Bones. Tell me what progress you make, and what news you hear from Petty and the rest. And please do not make the mistake of trying to persuade any new southern acquaintances as to your views too forcibly. I understand that not all are content to answer merely with their mouths, as is our long-winded friend, Mr. Calhoun. Your affectionate friend, Charles. October 16th, 1850. Dear Richard, hello, and how are you? I have thought about you often since I have taken up residence here at Chapelwaite, and had half expected to hear from you. And now I receive a letter from Bones telling me that I'd forgotten to leave my address at the club. Rest assured that I would have written eventually anyway, as it sometimes seems that my true and loyal friends are all I have left in the world that is sure and completely normal. And Lord, how spread we've become. You in Boston writing faithfully for the Liberator, to which I have also sent my address incidentally. Hanson in England on another of his confounded jaunts, and poor old Bones in the very lion's lair, recovering his lungs. It goes as well as can be expected here, Dick, and be assured I will render you a full account when I am not quite as pressed by certain events which are extant here. I think your legal mind may be quite intrigued by certain happenings at Chapelwaite and in the area about it. But in the meantime, I have a favor to ask, if you will entertain it. Do you remember the historian you introduced me to at Mr. Clary's fundraising dinner for the cause? I believe his name was Bigelow. At any rate, he mentioned that he made a hobby of collecting odd bits of historical lore which pertain to the very area in which I am now living. My favor, then, is this. Would you contact him and ask him what facts, bits of folklore, or general rumor, if any, he may be conversant with about a small deserted village called Jerusalem's Lot, near a township called Preacher's Corners on the Royal River? It would gratify me intensely, and more important, may be a matter of some moment. In looking over this letter, I feel I've been a bit short with you, Dick, for which I am heartily sorry. But be assured I will explain myself shortly, and until that time I send my warmest regards to your wife, your two fine sons, and of October 16th, 1850. Dear Bones, I have a tale to tell you which seems a little strange and even disquieting to both Cal and me. See what you think. If nothing else, it may serve to amuse you while you battle the mosquitoes. 2 days after I mailed my last to you, a group of 4 young ladies arrived from the Corners, under the supervision of an elderly lady of intimidatingly competent visage named Mrs. Cloris, to set the place in order and to remove some of the dust that has been causing me to sneeze seemingly at every other step. They all seemed a little nervous as they went about their chores. Indeed, one flighty miss uttered a small screech when I entered the upstairs parlor as she dusted. I asked Mrs. Cloris about this. She was dusting the downstairs hall with grim determination that would have quite amazed you, her hair being done up in an old faded bandana. And she turned to me and said with an air of determination, "They don't like the house, and I don't like the house, sir, because it has always been a bad house." My jaw dropped at this unexpected bit, and she went on in a kindlier tone. "I do not mean to say that Stephen Boone was not a fine man, for he was. I cleaned for him every second Thursday all the time he was here, and I cleaned for his father, Mr. Randolph Boone, until he and his wife disappeared in 18 and 16. Mr. Stephen was a good and kindly man, and so you seem, sir, if you will pardon my bluntness. I know no other way to speak. But the house is bad, and it always has been. And no Boone has ever been happy here since your grandfather Robert and his brother Philip fell out over stolen," and here she paused almost guiltily, "items in 17 and 89. Such memories these folks have, Bones. Mrs. Cloris continued, "The house was built in unhappiness, has been lived in with unhappiness. There has been blood spilt on its floors. There has been disappearance and accident. I have worked here, Mr. Boone, and I am neither blind nor deaf. I've heard awful sounds in the walls, sir, awful sounds, thumpings and crashings, and once a strange wailing that was half laughter. It fair made my blood curdle. It's a dark place, sir." And there she halted, perhaps afraid she had spoken too much. As for myself, I hardly knew whether to be offended or amused, curious or merely matter-of-fact. I'm afraid that amusement won the day. "And what do you suspect, Mrs. Cloris? Ghosts? Rattling chains?" But she only looked at me oddly. "Ghosts there may be, but it's not ghosts in the walls. It's not ghosts that wail and blubber like the damned and crash and blunder away in the darkness. It's—" "Come, Mrs. Cloris," I prompted her. "You've come this far. Now you can finish what you've begun." The strangest expression of terror, pique, and, I would swear to it, religious awe passed over her face. "Some die not," she whispered. "Some live in the twilight shadows between to serve him." And that was the end. For some minutes I continued to tax her, but she grew only more obstinate and would say no more. At last I desisted, fearing she might gather herself up and quit the premises. This is the end of one episode, but a second occurred the following evening. Calvin had laid a fire downstairs, and I was sitting in the living room, drowsing over a copy of the Intelligencer, and listening to the sound of wind-driven rain on the large bay window. I felt comfortable, as only one can on such a night, when all is miserable outside, and all is warmth and comfort inside. But a moment later, Cal appeared at the door, looking excited and a bit nervous. "Are you awake, sir?" he asked. "Barely," I said. "What is it?" "I found something upstairs I think you should see," he responded with the same air of suppressed excitement. I got up and followed him. As we climbed the wide stairs, Calvin said, "I was reading a book in the upstairs study, a rather strange one, when I heard a noise in the wall." "Rats," I said. "Is that all?" He paused on the landing, looking at me solemnly. The lamp he held cast weird, lurking shadows on the dark draperies, and on the half-seen portraits that seemed now to leer rather than smile. Outside, the wind rose to a brief scream, and then subsided grudgingly. "Not rats," Cal said. "There was a kind of blundering, thudding sound from behind the bookcases, and then a horrible gurgling. Horrible, sir. And scratching, as if something were struggling to get out, to get at me." You can imagine my amazement, Bones. Calvin is not the type to give way to hysterical flights of imagination. It began to seem that there was a mystery here after all, and perhaps an ugly one indeed. "What then?" I asked him. We had resumed down the hall, and I could see the light from the study spilling forth onto the floor of the gallery. I viewed it with some trepidation. The night seemed no longer comfortable. The scratching noise stopped. After a moment, the thudding, shuffling sounds began again, this time moving away from me. It paused once, and I swear I heard a strange, almost inaudible laugh. I went to the bookcase and began to push and pull, thinking there might be a partition or a secret door. "You found one?" Cal paused at the door to the study. "No, but I found this." We stepped in, and I saw a square black hole in the left case. The books at that point were nothing but dummies, and what Cal had found was a small hiding place. I flashed my lamp within it, and saw nothing but a thick fall of dust which must have been decades old. "There was only this," Cal said quietly, and handed me a yellowed foolscap. The thing was a map, drawn in spider-thin strokes of black ink, the map of a town or village. There were perhaps 7 buildings, and one clearly marked with a steeple bore this legend beneath it: "The worm that doth corrupt." In the upper left corner, to what would have been the northwest of this little village, an arrow pointed. Inscribed beneath it, Chapelwaite. Calvin said, "In town, sir, someone rather superstitiously mentioned a deserted village called Jerusalem's Lot. It's a place they steer clear of." "But this?" I asked, fingering the odd legend below the steeple. "I don't know." A memory of Mrs. Cloris, adamant yet fearful, passed through my mind. "The worm," I muttered. "Do you know something, Mr. Boone?" "Perhaps. It might be amusing to have a look for this town tomorrow. Do you think, Cal?" He nodded, eyes lighting. We spent almost an hour after this, looking for some breach in the wall behind the cubbyhole Cal had found, but with no success. Nor was there a recurrence of the noises Cal had described. We retired with no further adventure that night. On the following morning, Calvin and I set out on our ramble through the woods. The rain of the night before had ceased, but the sky was somber and lowering. I could see Cal looking at me with some doubtfulness, and I hastened to reassure him that should I tire or the journey prove too far, we would not hesitate to call a halt to the affair. We had equipped ourselves with a picnic lunch, a fine buck-white compass, and, of course, the odd and ancient map of Jerusalem's Lot. We had gone no more than 2 miles when we struck an overgrown road of what I believe were once called the corduroy variety. This tended in our general direction, and we struck off along it, making brisk time. We spoke little. The day, with its still and ominous quality, weighed heavily on our spirits. At about 11 o'clock we heard the sound of rushing water. The remnant of road took a hard turn to the left, and on the other side of a boiling, slaty little stream, like an apparition, was Jerusalem's Lot. The stream was perhaps 8 feet across, spanned by a moss-grown footbridge. On the far side, Bones, stood the most perfect little village you might imagine, understandably weathered, but amazingly preserved. Several houses, done in that austere yet commanding form for which the Puritans were justly famous, stood clustered near the steeply sheared bank. Further beyond, along a weed-grown thoroughfare, stood 3 or 4 of what might have been primitive business establishments. And beyond that, the spire of the church marked on the map, rising up to the gray sky and looking grim beyond description, with its peeled paint and tarnished leaning cross. "The town is well named," Cal said softly beside me. We crossed to the town and began to poke through it. And this is where my story grows slightly amazing, Bones, so prepare yourself.